what's the best quote, what's the best anecdote, what's the best thing that makes me tell everyone in this room, hey, this is actually important. Suffice it to say, while I was trying to decide that, just last week there was an I.R.A. bombing in Belfast. So if that doesn't speak to ongoing legacy in the shadow of the events discussed here today, clinging over, I'm not really sure what else I could bring up. Apart from my second intro that I originally went with, that I like too much to not include, is that last spring when I was interning at the National Cemetery of Ireland, Glasnevin, I noticed that people buried there, regardless of national hero, their service in the war, regardless, they were split right down the middle. What I found is that in death, even so many years later, they were divided along where they came out in relation to the Civil War. They were not allowed to intermingle in the plots of each other, regardless of how many years they spent on the same side. Up there in the black is the anti-treaty side, and in the white, the pro-treaty graves, clustered right around their commander-in-chief, Michael Collins, up there, and then the President of the Irish Republic in the middle era up there. And this really speaks to a huge cultural impact on Ireland of these events that, although relatively low body count, relatively low run of the war, continue to hang over Ireland. And the most profound impact was on the people that were buried here. So I'd like to introduce some of the voices that I utilized in this work. That is Ernie O'Malley. He was 25 years old when he led the I.R.A.'s 2nd Southern Division in the Irish Civil War. Liam Deasy was 26 when he led the 3rd Cork Brigade in the Civil War. Dan Breen was on the older side at 28 when he led the 3rd Tipperary Brigade in the I.R.A. to the Civil War. Francis Carty was younger, 23, when he led the South Wexford Brigade. Michael O'Donoghue was even younger, 22 years old, when he went to war with the Cork I.R.A. in 1922. Nick Mansfield, still right around middle, 25 years old at the time of the events discussed. So, introducing why the I.R.A. fought the Civil War is that these young men that grew up alongside the Revolution fought the Civil War to protect their ownership that they felt of the Revolution. That if they gave in, then they would be hurting their legacy and they would be giving up everything they fought for. And what kind of men were the I.R.A.? Well, they were not revolutionary intellectuals, they were not repressed proletarian workers, they were not starving countryside farmers. By and large, they were people like you and me, middle class, steady, stable lives, careers ahead of them. They were 2 to 3 times more likely to be found in unskilled, semi-skilled, skilled labor. And although agriculture took up the majority of the male labor in Ireland at the time, it was severely underrepresented within the men of the I.R.A. volunteers. Another contributing factor was that the I.R.A., as previously shown, was overwhelmingly young. From 1919 to 1921, the war against the British, 89% of the leadership was younger than 30, with a further 88% of the rank and file being younger than 30 as well. This youth stiffened in the Irish Civil War. In 1922, 76% of the leadership was younger than 30, while a staggering 92% were younger than 30 throughout the course of their war. These numbers are important because in 1922 to 23, these were not based on who was coming in, but they were based on who remained with the I.R.A. and stuck with the Irish Republic. Youth had a profound impact on the kind of guerrilla army that the I.R.A. was. Through common experiences they grew up, and through the kind of ridiculously brazen attempts at warfare that a group of young men trying to figure out guerrilla warfare would attempt. The shared experiences they grew up gave them many shared experiences. They grew up in the full force of a cultural revival in the late 19th century, the Gaelic revival. They would have spoken the Irish language, played Irish sports, enjoyed Irish arts. They had a profound sense of Irish culture instilled in them. And then as they matured, it was right alongside the Easter Rising, the introduction of separatist politics to Ireland. So they began to feel that their father's generation was associated with home rule and self-governance, but their generation, as they matured, was associated with separatist politics. Michael O'Donoghue, who was 13 at the time that the first Irish paramilitary, the Irish Volunteers, were created, remembers being incredibly impressed with their martial spirit. A bunch of men in the interest of Irish aims, clad in green uniforms for the first time. He was so impressed that when the Easter Rising occurred in 1916, despite being just 16 years old at the time, he grabbed his father's gun, ran out to the railroad, and fired a few shots at the train that was departing for Dublin. The youth also had an impact on the kind of leadership and creativity that they would bring to the war. With a large portion of the leadership being young men with no prior military experience who were essentially making it up as they went along. Ernest Blythe, taking part in the Irish Volunteers from their inception, effectively took control of his unit after his commanding officer issued an incorrect order, causing a group of girls that were watching them to laugh at them, which hurt Blythe so deeply that he broke rank, pushed his officer aside, and started giving the orders himself. Carty rode a similar authoritative wave. He gained control of his unit by being more active and ambitious, suggesting to the leadership that something be done. The thing he did was that he robbed 2 policemen only to find they were unarmed, but regardless, he took control of his unit. The I.R.A. was not incredibly conducive to guerrilla warfare for all of the reasons previously stated. They were young, they had no prior experience, they were figuring it out as they go. A lot of their attacks were failed, but the ones that were successful stand out. Carty recalled a lot of his failed and aborted attacks, called them harebrained schemes in his memoir. The I.R.A. organization was largely informal, so it was entirely on the regional commanders like Francis Carty and the other men discussed to determine how the course of the war would happen in that particular area. There was no rigid national organization that coordinated the units throughout the country. The conflict was highly regionalized and unevenly spread throughout the country. Some I.R.A. leaders were only concerned with their area, so when I.R.A. units forced the withdrawal of the police, they were left largely in unopposed control of their area. That opened the door for Dáil Éireann, the revolutionary Irish government, to begin judicial practices like courts and policing, supplementing the rule of the I.R.A. units in the area. The I.R.A.'s relationship with the revolutionary parliament, Dáil Éireann, was a complex one. They were nominally on the same side, but never under the same roof, and acted in a kind of parallel revolution to each other, a political and a military front that intermingled but never were in line with each other. Add to this that in the Munster counties, this regional leadership became incredibly effective, and they began to have a feeling that they were going to win the war if given enough time and enough manpower. They felt confident in their ability to win in a military victory over the British and establish the Irish Republic that had been proclaimed by the martyred leaders in 1916. Owing to the regional nature of the Irish War of Independence and the informal connections between the I.R.A. and their political and military leadership in Dublin, news of a truce on the 11th of July 1921 had many varied reactions that had everything to do with how the war was going in that area. Areas like South Wexford, where Francis Carty had waged his war, met the truce as a much-needed respite, frustrated by the lack of success and being eager to have a moment to catch their breath. In the Munster counties, however, where they felt they were winning the war, they felt frustrated and held back. The I.R.A. units here begrudgingly accepted the opportunity to rearm and supply, but for the express purpose of resuming war with the British in due time. As the truce progressed, they considered breaking it many times, fearful that the British would do so first, and indeed during the truce there were many murders, kidnappings, and other blatant breaches of the truce. Yet it still held. And while it held, a delegation of the Irish revolutionary politicians went to London to negotiate a treaty that would bring peace to Ireland. During these negotiations, it was made clear that the Irish Republican Army had been fighting for would not be on the table, and the Irish delegates made the decision to not communicate this to the I.R.A. The I.R.A. found out this information when it reached the newspapers, and there was an immediate and severe reaction among the ranks. They thought that the terms were eerily similar to the home rule of their father's generation, so they felt that they had lost a lot of the ground that they had gained over the past nearly 10 years at that point. None of the I.R.A. loved the terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. It maintained Ireland as a dominion of the British Empire. It gave up the northern Protestant counties. It had every member of the government sign an oath of allegiance to the English king, and it maintained itself within the British Empire. The difference in opinion of the I.R.A. initially is on the belief of whether or not the situation could be used to achieve the Irish Republic, or whether it would impede it. The I.R.A. members anxiously watched as Dáil Éireann debated the terms of the treaty in Parliament. They watched with horror as Dáil Éireann narrowly ratified it, 64 to 57 in favor. A very, very close split that would have devastating impacts in the months to come. They expected them to reject it, and now they were left questioning what to do next. As the new year dawned, January 1922 was a confusing time in Ireland as the British were under the guise of evacuating as quickly as possible. It came to light during this, as the I.R.A. began to have their reaction, that more than half of them were outright against the treaty. Those highlighted in dark on the screen there are those who rejected the terms of the treaty and would do whatever it took to react against this imposition. In 1922, the provisional government, which was to take over from the British and set up the eventual Irish Free State, was in an unenviable position. Kevin O'Higgins of the provisional government described it as simply 8 young men in the city hall standing amidst the ruins of one administration, with the foundations of another not yet laid, and with wild men screaming through the keyhole. No police force was functioning through the country. No systems of justice was operating. The wheels of administration hung idle, battered out of recognition by the clash of rival jurisdictions. The Irish Republic was still an underground state, so either republic or free state, it would need to be built from the ground up. Already by late January, the provisional government decided that the I.R.A. could not be dealt with if they were going to be so belligerent. So in secret, they began building their own provisional government loyal force. They drew the recruits from the rank and file of the I.R.A., feeling that they were having the revolution sucked out of them and put into terms that they did not want. These troops would be allowed to take over all the garrisons in Dublin, attempting to shut the I.R.A. out of the capital, and later on trying to shut them out of the national situation entirely. The I.R.A. needed to decide where they stand in relation to this, so they scheduled an army convention for March 1922. Gathering that, while initially endorsed by the provisional government, grew to be banned. So every I.R.A. member who was pro-treaty did not attend the convention and turned it into an anti-treaty think tank. At this convention, they elected their chief of staff, Liam Lynch, in the middle here, and affirmed that they would uphold the Irish Republic if no one else would. They were to act as a host unto themselves, and a member of the executive, in his quest to uphold the Irish Republic, when asked if this meant military dictatorship, he said, "You can take it that way if you want." The newly formed distinction between the I.R.A. and the Free State made the issue of British evacuated barracks being taken over by Irish troops more difficult, as now a barrack going to pro or anti-treaty unit was regarded as an upper hand against the other faction. In Limerick, British barracks were hastily occupied by pro-treaty troops from outside County Limerick, causing an escalation from the I.R.A., who brought in reinforcements to try and dislodge the Free Staters, failing in their rush in occupying buildings within the city. Civil war threatened to break out in Limerick, only diffused by an intervention by national leadership on both sides. Situations just like this would crop up throughout the country and threaten civil war, in some cases exchanging in gunfire. To fix the perceived slight of the I.R.A. being shut out of Dublin, hardline members of the I.R.A. had seized the judicial center in Dublin, the Four Courts, and turned it into the I.R.A. headquarters, where they would run their operations. This flagrant act of disobedience greatly hurt the authority of the new Irish state, and terrified the British authorities who were closely monitoring the situation while they were still evacuating from the country. The I.R.A. were in an extreme position of power at this point, in the hands of large parts of the country and now a significant portion of the city center of the capital. Yet the I.R.A. did not want to attack the Irish Free State at this time. They were more interested in bringing them to their side. Suggestions that the I.R.A. abandon their goal of the Irish Republic in the name of peace were disregarded, so it would be the Free State joining their side or no peace at all. They found common ground in the recently excluded Ulster counties, where the Free State was willing to join them. They have reinforced security from the British troops that were evacuating from Southern Ireland and relocated in the north. And the Northern I.R.A. affirmed that while the war ended in 1921, it persisted in the north. So this developed as common ground between both sides of the I.R.A. They worked out a scheme where the Free State and I.R.A. troops would collaborate, the I.R.A. troops doing the fighting while the Free State troops supplied them with arms. The I.R.A. troops liberated the towns of Ballick and Pettigo in County Fermanagh, where there were also Free State troops assisting. In the north, there seemed to be proof that the I.R.A. and Free State troops could work together in opposition to their true enemy, Britain. However, the cooperation was complex, and there were disagreements about where reinforcements would come from, who would lead, who would gain control of the new territories, and so on. On numerous occasions, the I.R.A. and the Free Staters fought against each other, sometimes resulting in deaths on either side. Regardless, the cooperation that was proven in the north became the basis for the I.R.A.'s plan to rescue the national situation, to trigger war with Britain so that the Free State would rejoin their side, and they could carry the war to victory after it was deferred by the truce of July 1921. The I.R.A. was encouraged when the British counterattacked at Pettigo and Ballick. A battle that saw 5 days of fighting with the Free State and I.R.A. troops fighting alongside each other. But after the towns were recaptured by the British, they advanced no further, and the Free State withdrew from the operation for fear of breaking the peace with the British. Regardless of success in the north, the I.R.A. desperately wanted to renew war with the British, continually attacking them throughout the first 6 months of 1922, as the British were withdrawing from the country. They attacked and kidnapped British troops and officers, captured barracks not yet evacuated, piled up garrison troops and seized their equipment, even staged a heist on a British vessel off the coast of Ireland. The British restrained themselves to not retaliate, as the new attack on the I.R.A. risked reuniting the Irish factions against them. The I.R.A. belligerents would grow intolerable, however, in June 1922, when I.R.A. men assassinated British Field Marshal Henry Wilson, a staunch Unionist and security advisor to Northern Ireland. This attack came after a June general election that saw the pro-treaty Free States win 78% of the vote, 3/4, and a clear majority that they needed to act with impunity. Coupled with the assassination of Field Marshal Wilson, British would no longer put up the I.R.A. in occupation of the Four Courts, demanding that the Free State remove the I.R.A. from the Four Courts or consider the Anglo-Irish Treaty broken. In the situation I mentioned, it is exactly what the I.R.A. had wanted, to force a decision by the Free State on whether they would stand with the Irish Republic or stand by their British allies. The Free State evidently made the decision the I.R.A. did not anticipate, issuing an ultimatum to evacuate the Four Courts by 4 in the morning on June 28, 1922. The I.R.A. did not evacuate, so the Free State Army, using 18-pound artillery lent by the British, opened fire on the Four Courts after the ultimatum expired. The I.R.A. met the beginning of hostilities with disbelief, not anticipating that the Free State would side with the British, only realizing the gravity of the situation after it had already begun. Liam Deasy, who was in Dublin, but outside of the Four Courts, remembered talking to Chief of Staff Liam Lynch about the beginning of the war. He wrote that for both of us, it was the end of a dream. This was effectively the calamitous end of the Irish Revolution, although months of fighting were to follow. The I.R.A. had no coherent strategy, and relief for the men defending the Four Courts was hard to come by. The relief column got stuck on O'Connell Street on the wrong side, from which the Free State continued to use artillery against these entrenched positions that could not resist artillery bombardment. During the Dublin fighting, seasoned rebel and former Minister of Defense Cathal Brugha stayed behind in Dublin to cover the retreat of the I.R.A. fleeing the city. He was gunned down while allegedly approaching the Free State troops with a revolver in each hand. What followed was a 2-month-long fighting retreat from Dublin toward Munster. They attempted to establish Munster as the Irish Republic in the southwest part of the country, the traditional bedrock of the Republican resistance from the War of Independence going on into the Civil War. The I.R.A. lost battle after battle in this retreat, not being able to hold cities and towns against Free State artillery and armored cars. Liam Lynch proposed an I.R.A. defensive line to defend the Munster Republic, extending from Limerick to Waterford. This line would be broken in spectacular fashion at the Battle of Kilmallock, one of only 2 pitched battles during the Irish Civil War. At the same time this is happening, the Free State landed many troops behind the I.R.A. lines in Cork and Kerry, encircling the I.R.A. and ending the conventional phase of the war. They had been militarily beaten in just under 2 months, and the I.R.A. realized that the war was futile, but they instead resolved themselves to wage a hopeless guerrilla war that the Free Staters had and attempt to reprise the war against the British in 1919 to 1921. At this stage in the war, there were noticeable deaths in the leadership, especially Michael Collins, who had been in the struggle since he was 26 at the Easter Rising and one of the most prominent figures of the struggle. On August 22nd, 1922, he was killed in an I.R.A. ambush in his home, County Cork, closing a possible bridge for reconciliation between the two sides. 12 days earlier, on the 10th of August, Arthur Griffith, founder of Sinn Féin, former president of Dáil Éireann, and the Provisional Government's Minister for Foreign Affairs, died in Dublin of a cerebral hemorrhage, or, according to legend, of a broken heart. The war was no longer for the purpose of creating an independent Irish Republic, but now to continue the existence of the I.R.A., who were being hunted and crushed beneath the boot of the new government. The Free State government instituted a bill granting the Army to officially execute men in the field, in response to which Liam Lynch ordered all politicians who voted for the bill assassinated. After the 2 pro-treaty politicians were assassinated, the Free State executed 4 men in their custody since the capture of the Four Courts. The Free State strategy to beat the I.R.A. is becoming more and more based on blood for blood, a war of attrition the Free State knew they could win. The Catholic Church lent their support to the Free State, declaring the I.R.A. carrying out a guerrilla war against the Free State would be committing murder before God and would not receive absolution or be admitted to Holy Communion. Even if this didn't have profound consequences for the young Catholic men of the I.R.A., it alienated them from the rest of the Irish society. The I.R.A. could not count on the support of the population anymore. Indeed, the population in many parts of the country was openly hostile and welcomed the return of Free State troops as the return of authority and government to those areas. The success of the guerrilla campaign was effectively dead on arrival because the I.R.A. was missing 2 of these factors: home ground advantage and the support of the people, both of which were gone by virtue of fighting an Irish government army. A significant portion of the Free State Army as well, especially the leadership, were formerly I.R.A. men and knew the tactics. They also knew their safe houses, places they would hide. They knew how to beat them and exactly what they would have to do. The winter of 1923 saw the I.R.A. in a dire condition, yet still determined to strike back in any way that they could. The Free State would meet this with extreme brutality to persuade the I.R.A. of the futility of continued resistance to the Free State. In addition to official executions, they would institute many unofficial executions in the field, often in barbaric ways, that attempted to pummel the I.R.A. into submission. This culminated in March 1923, regarded as the terror month in Republican histories, where the Free State Army killed 23 I.R.A. men in the field. The most infamous of this was the Valley City Massacre, where Free State troops removed 9 I.R.A. prisoners under the guise of using them to remove a landmine, a policy adopted in retaliation for the killing of Free State troops by an I.R.A. mine. Free State troops took the men out to a roadside near Valley City, gathered them in a circle around a landmine, bound them together, and then detonated the landmine. What followed was a shower of limbs and gore, in which one man, Stephen Fuller, miraculously survived by being thrown a significant distance away. The Free State troops had no means of identifying the mangled bodies, so they drove back to the barracks, where they had prepared 9 coffins and given 9 names to the press. Just as a wounded Fuller dragged himself to the closest home and told them what had happened. In addition to these atrocities like these in Cary, the Free State adopted a policy where I.R.A. attacks would result in the execution of I.R.A. men held by the Free State, effectively using them as hostages. This greatly dissuaded the I.R.A. from further offensive operations, cognizant of the fact that each attack they made would kill a friend and comrade. Yet the I.R.A. still held onto their guns, fighting to stay alive at this point. The beginning of the end happened when I.R.A. Chief of Staff Liam Lynch was shot dead in action at a skirmish near the Knockmill Down Mountains, but also captured several other members of the senior I.R.A. leadership. Lynch had maintained that he would not entertain the thought of surrender or capitulation, so his removal opened the door for more moderate and pragmatic leaders to possibly stand down the I.R.A. This is exactly what the Northern I.R.A. leader, Frank Aiken, decided. He ordered the I.R.A. troops in late April to cease hostilities and then later on in May to dump their arms. And notably at this stage, they still did not surrender. They held on to their guns for use in a future struggle, still clinging to their Republican belief and refusing to admit defeat. By the close of the Irish Civil War, just under 1,500 people had been killed. By historical standards, a tiny body count, but the effects were profound. Politics were forever scarred by the memory of the Irish Civil War, not held by the fact that the 2 largest political parties for most of Ireland's history were the direct descendants of the pro- and anti-treaty camps of the Republican movement. Many years of politics were also further scarred by the fact that the veterans of the Civil War went on to political life, and their battles now enter the chambers of dull iron rather than the battlefield. The cultural damage was also extensive. Some families no longer spoke to one another thanks to the fallout of the Civil War. In addition to this, the loss of men like Michael Collins, Cathal Brugha, Arthur Griffith, Liam Lynch, and the many young men executed by the Free State makes us wonder just what could have been possibly achieved had they not been taken away from us by the Irish Civil War. And with that, I'd like to conclude with a quote from Michael Collins just before the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Give us the future, we've had enough of your past. Give us back our country to live in, to grow in, to love. Within less than a year, he would have been shot dead in County Cork. Thank you for listening.
All right, we have a couple minutes for questions. Any questions from the audience?
This is going to sound like a dumb question. So Michael Collins was killed by treaty forces, right?
Anti-treaty forces.
Anti-treaty.
Yeah, by the I.R.A.
So he was on the side of the Free State.
Yes, he was
Okay.
The chairman of the Provisional Government, and he was also acting Chief of Staff of the Provisional Government Army. He was in County Cork, surveying troop positions, allegedly to try and talk some of the Cork I.R.A. men that he would have known because he grew up in Cork into standing down when they got word of his convoy and ambushed him.
But he had been in the I.R.A., right?
Yeah, he had been
In the
de facto I.R.A. head. He was not Minister of Defense or Chief of Staff, but he called a lot of the shots.
So they saw him as like betraying the...
Yes. They viewed him ultimately as a traitor. He was the biggest push of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. A lot of his prominence is what sold a lot of the population on accepting it. They used to say, what's good enough for Mick is good enough for me. So that brought a lot of the men who knew him intimately, close friends of his, decided to side with him. But another of his close friends, Harry Boland, regardless of that, would still end up on the other side of the treaty divide. He died just a month before him, and they had a very bad falling out over the terms of the treaty.
What was the treaty and like the terms of the treaty?
The Anglo-Irish Treaty was an allowance of self-governance for Ireland, so it was not full independence. It was how like Canada and Australia were treated within the British Empire, that they had a degree of self-government, but they had an association with Britain, that they would rely on each other for defense. They had strong economic ties, that kind of thing.
Henry, you suggest also that many of the I.R.A. thought that they hadn't achieved anything because it seemed very similar to home rule. In what ways do you think it was similar to home rule?
I mean, on the most basic thing, they did not get a country called the Irish Republic. They got a country called the Irish Free State. There was, like I said before, still that association with Britain. The oath of allegiance was very antithetical to everything that they had been fighting for. It did allow for more than home rule. Under home rule, the Irish would not have had a self-defense force. They would not have been allowed an armed force. The government would have been more limited. It would have been just a more autonomous British region rather than that dominion. But they did really feel that it was like a walk back. They felt that they had outgrown the home rule issue, and that after how many years of bloodshed, after the Easter Rising, the War of Independence, it was just no longer acceptable to get independence, but.
So was the I.R.A. fighting for like complete independence from Britain?
Yes.
Okay.
They were fighting for complete independence from Britain and also a unified Ireland. The 6 Protestant counties, like I said earlier, were excluded. They opted out of the Irish Free State because they did not want to be ruled by a predominantly Catholic Ireland. They thought it would turn them into a national minority and they would get subjected to unfair laws, that kind of thing. So that was another big rallying cry, is that they wanted full independence and the entire island under one government.
Where do you see economic causes for all this political strife?
As far as my research didn't show too many economic causes, it would factor into a lot of the civilian experience though. The I.R.A. men had been on the run for years at that point. In the earlier part of the conflict, a lot of them did stay within their jobs and then just go out for the odd I.R.A. operation. But when, around 1920, they went on the run, their job became being in the I.R.A. But for the civilian population, economics were a very big issue. That part of the way the I.R.A. waged their campaign was economic destruction, especially during the Civil War. They did a lot to disrupt infrastructure. They blew up railroads. They withheld food from towns. They accepted the breaking up of this national infrastructure under the guise that hardship would bring more people to their side and kind of renew that struggle. But for the I.R.A., the economics were secondary. They just kind of took what they pleased when they needed to. After the four courts set up the independent executive, they achieved their funding by robbing a bunch of banks in Ireland that bankrolled food and clothing and munitions and that kind of thing throughout the country. That because they were separated from the national leadership that would give them funding, they just had to take what they can to survive.
We also explored early on, last fall, whether there was like any kind of Marxist ideology or socialist, if there was any kind of economic-based ideology. We didn't find anything.
No, the I.R.A. was, at this stage, was anti-leftist. They were very afraid of the Soviet politics at the time. And during the early parts of 1922, when there was that lack of authority in some of the southern counties, there were many Soviets set up at factories, which the I.R.A., as like the authority in the country, was actually used to suppress. In Dan Breen's account, he talks about one in Tipperary among a milk factory, where the I.R.A. was brought in to essentially just shoot at the factory a ton until they gave it up, and then they tore off the red flag.
Was part of the Irish animosity towards the English that eventually led to the uprising and then the Civil War, was conscription during the First World War?
Yes, absolutely. During the First World War, Sinn Féin, there was an election around the same time as conscription was meant to be instituted. And the reason the Irish Separatists won so many seats is that they took up the issue of conscription. They fronted themselves as the anti-conscription party. So they brought a lot of people to their cause. And in the I.R.A. as well, when conscription was threatened, young men who didn't want to go to war would seek refuge in the I.R.A. as a means to like escape that and just like as a front of resistance against it, because it was a very united front in Irish politics at the time, that even the home rule parties were in line with the separatist parties in resisting it, that just nobody at all wanted it.
You mentioned a bit about like the legacy of this before, like in the beginning, but is there like still an I.R.A. like effectively, or like?
It's like yes and no. Is that after the I.R.A. after this essentially ceased to exist, that they were entirely military defeated, they were not prominent in politics anymore. So that when the Troubles happened in Northern Ireland in the 60s, the I.R.A. that perpetrated that were technically an offshoot. They were the provisional I.R.A. that felt that the old I.R.A. was not doing enough. And then there were more splits from there. There was leftist I.R.A. members. There was there was a lot of splits. If I had a genealogy chart, it would probably go like ceiling to the floor.
All right, I thank you all for your questions. I think we need to wrap up so that we can talk. Thank you very much for a really interesting discussion. Now we invite you to just wait outside for a little bit.